Um, so, you know, growing up, I always played cards with my family. I love playing cards. And beyond playing cards, I think that I always loved strategy. I think that innately, if I were to describe myself, it would be as a strategist. And as I went through high school, you know how when you're little and people ask you the question, you know, the one question of, like, what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to do when you grow up? Like, well, who do you want to be? I never had an answer. I never knew. You know, nothing. My classmates, the people around me, that a lot of them had an idea, right? I want to be a lawyer. I want to be a doctor. I want to do X, Y, or Z. And for me, it was just like a total blank. Like, I have no idea. Like, it's too much pressure. There's too many options. And I don't know what I'm gonna love. I don't know what, I really want to. It just seems like a really important thing to determine what you're gonna wake up and spend all of your life force going after, right? And so I didn't know what I wanted to do. I did know that I didn't enjoy going to school, high school. It was kind of boring to me. I slept through class. I was tardy all the time. I skipped school. I graduated with a perfect 3.0 GPA, so straight B's, just really very average. And after high school, I didn't want to go to college because I had no idea what I wanted to pursue. So I kind of just took a year off. And that year has now turned into 20 years off, or 21 years off of school. And I worked at a restaurant. That was, I was working at a restaurant, serving tables, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and a friend of mine drove in. We had played cards together online spades, for, I was 18 years old at the time, and we had been spades partners for like 4 years, 4 or 5 years online. And he drove through my hometown. He came from Foxwoods Casino in Massachusetts, and he had gotten something like, I can't remember, 21st place or something in a tournament. And he had scored something like $3,500 or something like that, and he had the printout, and he had his headphones on, he had like his sunglasses on, and I'm like, dude, like, what is all this? He's like, this is my poker gear. And he showed me his results, and as an 18-year-old kid who's serving tables, and the biggest day of my life monetarily was, at that point, like, 200 or $250 that I made in one day. um, there was a big draw, right? It was like, oh, you're playing poker, and like you can make money doing that. Like, you could make a living doing this, right? And pretty much immediately that hooked me. I was like, wow, like, so this could be your life path. And him and I talked about it, and I called him up after he went back down to Florida. And yeah, I called him up after he went back down to Florida, and I asked him, hey, man, like, would you be willing to teach me and help me out if I were to actually pursue poker? And I get the sense that he was probably pretty lonely. He's a lone wolf going on his poker journey by himself. We had a lot of history together, and he knew that I was really big into strategy, and that it was something that, like, I spent a lot of time thinking about. So he said, yeah, um, if you want to move down to Florida, like, I'll help you out. I'll coach you. We can learn together. We can go play poker, like, on the boat together. And so that was kind of it for me. After that phone call, I remember being really excited, you know, really excited in a way that I had never been before, as it related to pursuing something as an adult. And I went straight to Books a Million. I guess I'm kind of dating myself, but I went to a physical bookstore back in 2003 and bought Super System. I bought Super System and the Sklansky Malmuth book, No Limit Hold'em for advanced players. Bought The Theory of Poker, and I just consumed all the books. I brought them to work with me before my shift. I read them for 30 minutes to an hour before I started working. I read them for 30 minutes to an hour every night when I got done working. And all I did was really think about poker and save money. And I was living with my grandparents at the time, and ended up saving my first bankroll, which was, I believe, $4,000. You know, it was not not an incredible amount of money to move 10 hours to pursue this, seemingly crazy occupation that didn't have a lot of support from friends or family, because nobody really knew what poker was, or that it was a thing. But if anybody would have asked me at the time, I would just tell them, like, I'm going to be a professional poker player. And like, I just, it was something that I knew in my bones that I had to pursue, and that I was, yeah. So I saved up the money. I moved down to Florida. I started playing poker, and got really lucky. I ran really well right at the beginning. I won, was playing 5-10 limit. I won my first like 10 or 15 sessions in a row, won some high hands, built up my bankroll a little bit, and then started playing, dabbling on party poker kind of on the side, as well as playing live poker. Hit a tournament for like $15,000. And, that was kind of the genesis of my poker career. And then after that, I moved back home. That was 2005-ish, something like that. And it essentially just became an online poker player until Black Friday in 2011.
Got it.
Yeah, so I think the biggest mistake that I made as a kid, there, being young is both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is that, I felt invincible, that, I'm going to save up $4,000, move to Florida, no sweat, and be a professional poker player. And it, like, there was no chance of failure, right? It just felt like it was destined to happen. And, with that, I think that's a blessing, right? Because it kind of gives you the courage, or to try something that, if you rationally thought about it, or if you had experience and wisdom, you would recognize that this is a long shot, right? That this is a very small percent chance of happening. And the curse of being young is being immature, right? Like, I think that just being immature, not being a professional, not playing as many hours as I should. Um, you know, I at one point I lost my wallet down in Florida. I existed with no identification, and like had $4,000 or $5,000 in my wallet. And that was pretty tough. Didn't, because I played poker, I didn't exactly, I wasn't great at building my credit. I wasn't great at being an adult and being able to take care of myself. I lent out a bunch of money. A friend of mine's parents, who I had known since childhood, essentially stole $10,000 or $15,000 from, me and my friend. So those were the mistakes. I didn't make the typical kind of poker player mistakes. Like, I never really, I never really gambled that much. I did have a pit, oh, minor pit stop in the slot machine arena when I was like 21, that cost me $5,000 or $6,000, but it wasn't the end of the world. I never was big into partying, never really never really wanted to go to the strip clubs, never really wanted to do any drugs or drink, and definitely didn't want to drink and play poker at the same time. But I would say my biggest leak was, my own immaturity, not being a professional, being lazier, a lot lazier than, I should have been. Really just kind of playing when I wanted to, when I felt like it, and not really taking care of myself, physically, mentally, spiritually, and just kind of relying on my own innate talent at being a poker player, and getting by on 10 to 15 to 20 or 30 hours a week.
Maybe.
Yeah. So training today is multifaceted for me. It's see, I'm a full-time coach now. I think it was actually hard for me to change my identity in that way. Since 2004, I was a professional poker player, and as I mentioned before, like, it felt like my calling. It was a thing that I was very excited to pursue. And when my friend would tell people, like, oh, Brad, he doesn't have to work, a day in his life, if he doesn't want to, right? Like, that filled me with joy. And just my place on this planet was at a poker table, sitting down on the felt, playing cards, reading people, making money, losing money, feeling awful about mistakes that I made and trying to reconcile them. And like, I loved it. I just really loved the competitive aspect of it. I loved the mental aspect of it. It was my identity. And, about 3 years ago, when I started Chasing Poker Greatness, the podcast, and then I started selling courses and I started coaching, I think something interesting happened where I kind of realized that over time, this thing that I had fallen in love with, that had consumed me for almost 2 decades, had started to kind of become grindy. It had started to feel like work, like an obligation, and the joy just wasn't there for me like it was, in the beginning. And I imagine that this is going to happen with probably any career that you stay in over a couple of decades. But that was kind of how I felt, 3 or 4 years ago. And then, I started coaching. One of my students, John, who's now my business partner in my CFP, the CPG Wolves, and my Tactical Tuesday co-host, he started coaching with me. I believe it was like August or July of like 2020, I think. And by January, he had gone from 100 no limit to 1K and L. And in January, he ripped off, like a 50K month. We were making progress with every single coaching session that we had. And I realized, like, holy shit, like now I'm facilitating people's dreams, people achieving what they want to, carving out a life and a career playing this card game. Like, I'm helping him reach his goals and live that life. And I saw in him this earlier version of myself who, again, was ultra excited to sit down and play poker and spend his life pursuing this game at the highest possible level, that I could. And it just kind of stoked a fire in me that I didn't even realize was really, really there. And from that point on, coaching became more fun, more fulfilling than playing. And so now these days, again, I consider myself a full-time coach, because coaching, thinking about strategy, that's really all that I do with my entire existence. And I love it, and it's exceptionally fulfilling for me. And I really wouldn't have it any other way at this stage in my life. So, with that said, there are various ways that I study and learn poker in the current moment. I study data, I study solvers, and I think about how the game is constructed on a fundamental level. And I think about how to communicate information to other human beings in a way that they can understand, that they can implement and execute into their own games. So, I think that for me, the way that I learn currently is in thinking about how to communicate information to other players. It's seeing in my students, seeing in my my on contract players, the problems that they keep getting stuck on, and then reflecting and meditating on those problems, figuring out a solution and a path to resolve those leaks or help them resolve those leaks, and then just keep iterating, so on and so forth. That's pretty much how I spend my life. That's how I get better and train. Kind of interestingly, I think another thing that's really helped me this year has been, I started training jujitsu back in January, and I became a student all over again, where, I didn't know anything about anything. I never trained jujitsu before. I'd wrestled, but in like middle school. And so it was a very long time ago. And, I have a very high level coach who's really good at communication, really good at explaining things, and being being a student again in a new endeavor. Just, it really let me know, like it really allowed me to be a proxy for the people that I coach, and try to understand how they're thinking about poker and how I'm thinking about jujitsu, from the beginner standpoint, and then really upgrade my own coaching abilities by immersing myself in being a full-time student. So, I think that no matter what it is in life that I'm going through, no matter what it is in life that I'm pursuing, whatever hobby that may or may not be directly related to poker, I'm always trying to relate these life experiences back to poker so that, you know, my team, my guys, my players, my customers can all benefit from these lessons that at first glance may not seem super related to poker, but the reality is that at least jujitsu specifically is very similar to poker in the game tree, in just being tactician, being strategic. And so, yeah, I think all of those things. I know that was quite a long answer to your question. So I would say the biggest leak that I see in my students, customers, the people that I interact with on a regular basis is really not. I guess it boils down to kind of laziness. I think is probably the biggest leak. Laziness in the sense that maybe they're in a spot and they know like what the default solution is because of a solver, because of data or some other source of information, but then they just kind of stop there. They don't actually think about this exact scenario that they're in, the exact opponent that they're playing against, and then use the suggested solver strat, use the suggested data strat in a way that actually captures the most EV against a specific opponent that they're playing against. So, and laziness, I think also kind of goes into understanding how a solver works, right? Or how data works, just how these outputs, these strategic outputs are calculated, what goes into that, what does it mean? And then what happens when, a frequency is off by 15% in some direction, whether it be c-bet frequency, fold versus c-bet, fold versus turn c-bet, check raise, whatever it is. Like, what are the strategic ramifications of, that sort of strategic vulnerability, right? I think that's probably the thing that I encounter the most is just how, somebody asking, how do I play this spot? And then like, oh, I looked it up in GTO Wizard and this is the answer. And so like, oh, so I'm just going to, check raise a turn to whatever big blind the suggested strategy in GTO Wizard is, without really thinking more deeply about the spot and asking yourself, how do human beings tend to think about this spot? How do they tend to play the turn? Do I have any data points that can better inform me to make a more precise decision against this specific opponent? That sort of thing. So I would say that's the biggest leak, is just kind of settling on the first answer that they get, regardless of the source, and not really investing enough time and energy into understanding why this strategy is, or why the strategic output is what it is, and then the potential failure points of your opponents that you can really leverage to generate a lot more EV than they otherwise would. The only thing that I can really speak to, because there's a lot of different failure points in a poker player's career, like that makes them a losing player for one reason or another. The things that I see in the successful players, I think, are they really love strategy. They're very curious about strategy. They think about it a lot. They ask a bunch of questions. They don't really stop at the first answer that they get. That they kind of keep going down the rabbit hole and deepening their understanding of theory, data, humans, all of those things. And at least in my experience, I think that the successful players that I coach, when they make a mistake, it hurts them. They think about it. They want to resolve it. They're not like, they don't take any mistake that they make lightly. They don't take any data point that they should have considered or observed lightly. They really, really, really invest a lot of energy when they misplay a hand, when they miss something that they should have seen. They want to reconcile. Why did I miss that? Why didn't I see this alternative strategy? Like, what led to this failure point? Whereas folks that, don't really progress as quickly as others, they kind of just shrug their shoulders. Like, I made a mistake. Okay, let's move on to the next hand. And, I think that's a huge differentiator as it relates to players who progress and are willing to do the very difficult work of reconciling their mistakes, and players that kind of accept, yeah, I played that hand bad. Let's move on to the next one. Yeah, it's another tough question because I think that as human beings, a thing that I've learned from being a full-time coach is that different humans learn in different ways. Different tools and software resonates with different people. I've always enjoyed watching videos of high-level players playing and describing their thought process. So play and explain videos have been ultra beneficial for me personally. Solvers have been less beneficial for me, but I know that there are other people that are the exact opposite, where solvers exceptionally beneficial to them, play and explains not super beneficial. So I think ultimately understand how you learn, how understand what resonates with you, what style of learning resonates with you, and then pursue that specific style to the best of your ability. If it's open conversation and discussion, then find people that are also pursuing poker in the same way that you are, and talk to them about hand histories. Talk to them about strategy. Even if the strategic feedback isn't great, to where you can't upgrade your own thought process, right? So the players are, on a lower level than you. I think it's still ultimately very beneficial to have conversations with them, because in a way you're doing market research, right? You're understanding how your fellow man thinks about this game, how they consider making decisions, what drives them, what failure points they may have, what they don't always consider, or what they never consider. And ultimately that just helps you perform at a higher level when you play poker. So, for me, I think understand what helps you personally learn, and then pursue that. Pursue whatever resonates with you. And then ultimately, if you just want to brute force it and just looking for like a blanket sort of answer, I would say that gonna have to roll up your sleeves and memorize your pre-flop ranges, right? Like, if we're gonna get to a starting point, then that's the place to start, because every single hand that you play starts pre-flop, and it's a fundamental part of the game tree. You play just however many hands that you play in a month, 10 to 50,000 hands a month. Every single one of them starts pre-flop. So having that strategy down pat, to where you can know what to do in any given pre-flop situation just in your sleep, I think is probably the first starting point as it relates to playing poker at a high level. I've been in the world of mass data analysis now for, I think, like 2.5 years. I believe it was the beginning of 2021 when I started going down the mass data rabbit hole. And it's kind of been an interesting cycle, an interesting process through the world of data, where, as I mentioned before, my business partner, Tactical Tuesday co-host, John, our coaching relationship, it was pre-mass data, right? So that's always been an interesting thing to me, because his progression as a poker player in the online world happened before I was in the world of mass data, right? And just in recent memory, I used to think, like, what did we talk about? Like, what were our coaching sessions like when we didn't look at poker through the lens of data, and I think that ultimately I've come to a realization, in just really the last couple of months. And that is that, the benefit of data is that it gives you an overview of how people act in game at various spots in the game tree. What nodes do villains typically overfold? What nodes do they typically overbluff? What does range construction look like when villain places, different size bets on the flop, turn, river, that sort of thing? And I think that in that way, that's the major benefit of data, is understanding, the patterns that humanity falls into when they're playing poker, when they're at the tables, and sort of the strategic flaws in those patterns that sort of develop using a really big data set. Now, with that said, going back to what I said before about John, and me asking myself, like, what do we talk about? Well, I kind of realized what we talked about. It was high level conceptual information and strategic breakdowns of just various micro data points that he would encounter when he played. Now, for me, like a micro data point is, seeing a hand go to showdown and recognizing that, villain in this specific node, for whatever reason, overbluffed by a gigantic percentage, right? They have a hand that is just totally inappropriate to put a lot of money in the pot, going bet, bet, bet on the flop. So then what's the counter strategy once we observe this? Or why might villain have done this? Is there any sort of outside reason that they're like specifically targeting, some sort of recreational player? Or why did this go down? And if there's no reason strategically why a villain did what they did, then we can kind of make an assumption that it's part of their core strategy, that they're just betting too often with low equity hands for whatever reason, right? Maybe they want to win the pot. I don't know. I can't get inside their brain and really answer that. But, it is an important fundamental part of poker. And so the data kind of, if we were playing rock, paper, scissors against each other and we had never met each other, I'd never seen you play rock, paper, scissors in my life, a data-driven approach would be that I look at 5 million different matches of rock, paper, scissors, and I start to try to find the patterns of what tool is my opponent, or what tool does humanity throw more frequently than the other tools, and then kind of start there strategically where, solver-wise, I should be randomizing every single throw. Data-wise, maybe human beings just throw rock 45% of the time instead of 33% of the time. And then, paper and scissors, the other 55% of the time collectively, right? So if that were the case, then you should probably start out throwing paper, at least more frequently than your other options, because a general human being is going to be throwing rock, right? So that's kind of the power of mass data, is understanding the imbalances of somebody that you've never met before, that you've never played with, or the typical imbalances of a human being. With that said, maybe this person really likes scissors, right? And you learn very quickly that they're throwing scissors more frequently than rock, and they're sort of, an outlier as it relates to the data. Well, that human being who's throwing scissors more frequently than rocks, that's kind of what I consider a micro data point. And then you kind of adjust your strategy on the fly against this specific opponent in this spot, to take advantage of that observation that you've made against this specific human being. So to me, that's how I think of poker. That's how I bucket mass data is, you can develop a base strategy that works quite well against your average human being. But again, you can't be lazy. You still have to continue doing the work and still observe and analyze and figure out where this human being strategy is falling apart specifically, and then counter versus that specific opponent. So yeah, that's sort of how MDA fits into the framework of my coaching and really understanding of poker. I think that in this space, I mentioned that earlier that I feel like players have gotten kind of lazy, right? And that sort of laziness manifests in like, oh, I want an answer to this question. Log on GTO Wizard, look it up. I got my answer, and then you're done with it. You're not thinking about it anymore, right? And to me, that's just not enough work. You just have to keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And yeah, that laziness is what prevents people from actually going as deep as they could into understanding this game and building out a strategy that is going to capture 10, 15 big blinds per 100.
Yeah.
I don't use it personally, the artificial intelligence aspect. I have some of my players in my CFP have looked into the AI. I believe it before GTO Wizard bought it, or they merged with GTO Wizard. What is the name of it? Ruse. I was thinking Muse, but yeah, Ruse. So I haven't used Ruse AI at all personally, because ultimately, like right now, I feel like I have bigger fish to fry. The thing I think that typical human beings don't really realize about poker is how dynamic the game is and how big the game tree actually is, and how the failure points at the early nodes of the game tree really affect the strategic output of a solver or an AI in this just massive, massive, massive way. And because I think the poker population doesn't really think about that or hasn't invested a ton of energy into thinking about that, we kind of overrate these tools that show up in the poker landscape. You know, I've said for years that I think solvers have actually kept the games good in poker for, you know, the last 8 or 9 years, right? Because while a solver is a very powerful tool that can be extremely helpful and affect your poker game positively, most human beings misuse the outputs. They misuse the tool, and through that misuse, you know, I think it was Phil Galfond that said, you know, solvers allow poker players to play badly with confidence, right? And that tweet just to me hits the nail on the head that it's kind of become a crutch where, oh, I don't know if I played this hand well. Let's look at it in the solver. Oh, yep, I did. You know, this is a 10% frequency that bet that I should have made, so I did it. Yay, I played it well, right? And then don't really think about anything beyond that. Yeah, I think that solvers have kept the games good for the last 8 or 9 years. Now they have churned out some of the crushers of all crushers, right? They have churned out just some of the best players that have ever played the game. And I would say that it's because those players leveraged the solver in the correct way, used it to their advantage, and kept pushing and kept learning and kept growing based on, you know, their lessons from the solver. But yeah. So I'm not really working on anything in the PLO space right now. I do think about PLO a lot, and you know, I have a stated goal for my CFP, and that goal is for the average win rate of my wolves, or the collective win rate, to be 10 BBs per 100 over a million hands, right? That's sort of my internal, really big goal that I'm trying to facilitate. We're not there. Just spoiler alert, that goal is pretty big, I think. We're not there yet. And so for me, you know, PLO is the next game that I'm going to be looking at, analyzing, and breaking down strategically, and building out strats, and also, you know, almost certainly building out and growing the PLO side of the CPG Wolves. So it is a thing that's on my radar. It is something that I think a lot about, the strategy of PLO, but currently I don't have enough bandwidth because, you know, managing my 15 or so players and also running my business at the same time and training the jiu-jitsu 3 or 4 days a week, I just haven't had time to fully go all in on PLO. But I'll say this, when I think of PLO, it excites me strategically in a way that, you know, I felt when I was a teenager. I felt when, you know, I was in my early 20s as it relates to Hold'em, right? Because it's a totally different game. I think there's a lot of commonalities. There's a lot of overlap. I think it wouldn't take super long to transition to, you know, becoming a really strong PLO player, just based on my already existing foundation of knowledge and sort of how the game works, just the holistic game of poker. But I think that PLO is really cool in a way that it's insulated from solvers. It's insulated from AIs right now. It's really hard to get good information as it relates to the strategy of PLO, just because, you know, the game, the sheer number of combinations of hands you can have in PLO is so insanely high. I think it's something like there's 70,000 different combinations of hands that you can have pre-flop. That it just makes it a game where critical thinking, logical thought process is going to really be the king. And I think you see that when you listen to Phil Galfond describe his thought process while he's playing PLO, right? Or just watching Phil Galfond on Twitch, watching him on Run It Once, and just his ability to critically think and use what he knows about poker, what he knows about how the game works to his advantage. That to me is really exciting, and one of the fundamental reasons why I fell in love with poker in the first place. So yeah, I think that, you know, PLO, again, if hold'em cash games, if they were to die for whatever reason, if the platforms aren't able to upgrade their security and they just get overran by robots or just whatever it is that people are using to real-time assist them these days, then PLO is a good redundancy. I think it's a good game to know, and every single poker player should pursue the mastery of a secondary game just in case, right? Your livelihood could potentially be taken away from you. So you want to protect yourself in the event of that possibility. And I think that learning multiple games is just a really great way of protecting yourself. If you want to learn more about how I think about the game strategically, listen to Chasing Poker Greatness, the podcast, every Tuesday with John. Tactical Tuesday, we do 2 to 4 hand breakdowns, and we don't really hold much back as it relates to just putting the way that we think about poker out there for the world. So yeah, if you want to learn more, check out Tactical Tuesday. And if my style of coaching, my style of thinking about poker resonates with you, then I would suggest, hopping into my community, Greatness Village, buying a course, asking questions, and just immersing yourself in the world of playing cash games at a higher level. And that's really it.